Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. If you've not listened to the previous episode on Calvin Coolidge, please do, because again, I learned something new all the time. I learned a lot about Coolidge, who I previously just didn't know a whole lot about. But Dr. Beienberg is back with us, and today we're talking about another Calvin Coolidge speech, and this is actually an address on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So we're putting this here, 1926. Professor Beienberg, we have heard about Calvin Coolidge in the last episode, but what is so great about this speech in particular?
Yeah, I great's a good way to put it. I think this is easily one of the top 5 speeches given by, I might even put it higher than that, but I think it's easily in the top 5 speeches given by a president. It is a very, very, very thoughtful, political theory states it wrong, but it is like a very serious engagement with the founding in a way that is I think just really impressive. So the context, obviously, they're doing an Independence Day event at Independence Hall. And so he gives this address, and it's him basically summarizing what he thinks both the development of the Declaration of Independence is, as well as its sort of legacy. And so he has some interesting, and so a lot of it is what you would expect, sort of generic, like, patriotic, we're excited about this thing. But under the hood, there's a lot that's there that's really interesting. So he argues both that the American Revolution does things that are new, but it also is conservative in some ways. And so he's trying to basically say, like, what's it actually do that's new? What's it actually do that's continuing things on? So one thing he points out, and other folks will endorse this later, is he says, in some ways, the American Revolution is not a revolution how we often think of it. Because if we think of a revolution, society fundamentally looks different afterward. You have changed who's the leadership, you have changed your social structures, you have changed your institutions. And he says that, in fact, if you look, the folks in the American Revolution were basically the leaders of the colonial governments pushing back against Parliament, trying to assert more power over them. And so when he says conservative, he doesn't mean it in a left-right sense. He means it in the sense that they're saying, these are what the traditional liberties and understandings and division of power was in Britain. We just want that. We just want, I mean, we've looked at these texts before, like the Declaration of Resolves of 74. But if you look at basically up to the Declaration of Independence, it's King, please make sure Parliament gives us our British rights, right? Like that's the theme. King, please make sure that they're giving us our British rights. We like them. We don't want to destroy them. We don't want to destroy society. We want what has been guaranteed, that you are making the effort to take it away, right? And so he says, it is in no sense a radical movement, but took on the dignity of a resistance to illegal usurpations. It was conservative and represented the action of the colonists to maintain their constitutional rights, which from time immemorial had been guaranteed to them under the law of the land. So again, he's not saying conservative in like the left-right policy sense. He's just saying these are thoughtful people who are trying to protect the good things, the good political structures and ideas that they had. And so, he says that look at the founders. They're informed and mature convictions of a great mass of independent, liberty-loving, God-fearing people who knew their rights and possessed the courage to dare to maintain them. And he's very explicit in noting that there is a back and forth kind of deliberation of the people involved in the revolution, but also talking to the people around them, right? And so he says, look, there's long discussion. There's the result of duly authorized expression of the preponderance of public opinion, right? The delegates are coming saying, the people of North Carolina in our legislature want this, right? So there's this give and take. And he says, this isn't just people got mad and then they said like revolution time, right? And so he's very much emphasizing this theme that you see in the Declaration of Independence, right? The long train of usurpations, the repeated protests. And so that's something that he thinks is really important. And then he sort of walks through what the major themes are of the Declaration. And he says there's basically three things that the Declaration has in terms of its ideas. And he connects them to the text, but he summarizes them as no one is to be accounted as born into a superior station. Right? Nobody basically has arbitrary hereditary authority. Nobody has like some sort of inherent. And so this is doctrine of all men are created equal, right? As he says, like that's what it means. But there's no ruling class. And he says all possess rights which cannot be either bartered away or taken from them by an earthly power. And so Coolidge says that this is a synthesis of two older ideas that he says come from Dutch and especially English thought. The idea of individual rights and the right to choose your own rulers. Right? We see this from the Mayflower Compact. You see it from right. And then he says it's added to a new idea from the 18th century that he thinks most clearly comes from Protestantism, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but is most clearly articulated in the Declaration of Rights of Virginia, this idea of political equality, right? So he says these are the three fundamental ideas from the Declaration. And he argues, again, unsurprisingly, he's a New Englander, but he argues, and he says, look, I've got the documentary, he says, the documentary evidence. I love that. It's a line that you quote in a speech like this. And he says, basically, these come mostly from ideas that are common in Protestant churches, because he says, look, they preached equality because they believed in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, right? They thought that people were basically equal with each other because they were all creatures of God. So he says that comes from that idea. Placing every man on a plane where he acknowledged no superiors, no one possessed any right to rule over him, right? God alone, basically, he says, is the way that they think about that. And, the idea of natural rights, similar kinds of things. But he argues that these come from this. And this is one of the things that worries him. He says, a spring will cease to flow if its source is dried up. A tree will wither if its roots be destroyed. And he says, the Declaration of Independence is a spiritual document, not of material, but spiritual conceptions, right? Equality, liberty, popular sovereignty, rights of man. We can't see or touch them. These are ideas. And he says they ultimately come from his take from religious convictions. But he says basically he worries about, and this is why I get prickly of the Coolidge is just like a hedonist roaring 20s guy. He worries about a universe where he says it's pagan materialism and you're just measuring things by what kind of physical goods do they deliver? What kind of prosperity do they deliver? What do they do for me in that sense? And he says, no, right? These are built off of political ideas, which are built off of religious ideas. It's not just measuring the health of your society by how much stuff do you have, what your GDP is. And so he is pushing back on that notion. But the most famous part of the Declaration that I think is really, really perceptive is he uses this speech to engage with folks like Woodrow Wilson. He doesn't name him explicitly, but it's pretty clear that's the kind of folks he has in mind. So if you'll indulge me, I want to just read a couple paragraphs here.
Yes.
He's a good writer. He's a good writer in that sense. He says, about the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It's asserted the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776. We have new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day. And so therefore we can discard their conclusions for something more modern. And he says, but that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. Now, again, note that he's not saying that reasoning can never be applied. We should never have progress. But he says the idea that sort of we learn more does not apply to the Declaration. He says, if all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, no advance, no progress could be made beyond these propositions. And then he makes a really interesting move. He says, there are people who will try to deny their truth or their soundness. And he says, they think they're acting forward, but they're actually going backward to a time when there was no equality. There is no rights of the individual. There's no rule of the people. So he says, ironically, people who are critical of the founding in that sense are not progressives, they're reactionaries. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the revolutionary fathers. And so he's basically making the argument saying, if you reject this, you think you're a progressive, but you're basically endorsing feudalism, of the idea that a few people are sort of authorized to rule for you, that rights really don't matter, which is an argument that you see Wilson and others basically saying, like, no, we should think about collective rights instead of individual rights. And so then he goes on from there to say, and this is why we like the separation of powers and constitutionalism. But again, I just think it's a really interesting argument. And it's not necessarily like left right in the way that we think about politics, but just like we know, because you hear versions of this from the right as well, right? They're like, well, it's just the world is so different, we can't think about it. And Coolidge is not saying, of course, we're not going to have different regulatory policies or something. Fine. But fundamentally, the ideas of the founding, he says, if we think that these ideas matter, you're really only going to go backward to feudalism. And I think that's a really fascinating kind of inversion to say that, whether this is a sort of right version of Nazism or communism or whatever, that people who are convinced they have progress, he says, actually, they look more like the 16th century, the 17th century. And I just think that's a really interesting argument.
Love, because I was following along with his address as you were talking, and I love that he talks about how the principles of the Declaration are permanent.
Yeah.
Do you think that still holds up today, 250 years later?
I will say
from 1776, not from Coolidge's speech.
So Coolidge's, so Coolidge would argue, I'll say how Coolidge would answer that question. We talked about this a little last time. Coolidge would say human nature is still fundamentally the same, right? That these ideas come from something about human nature, that the ideas and the way that you design, broadly speaking, your institutions. That doesn't mean that you can't tinker with power and say this was a power of this part of government, now it's a part of that part of government. I guess the part that Coolidge would argue, I think that would contest for today, is he is very convinced that it is much harder to defend these ideas if you don't have that religious backstop, right? If you don't say, why are we equal? Because we're all basically creatures of God. Right, because I think he also probably has in mind somebody like Alexander Stevens, who we've talked about, that says, actually, no, we can look around and see that more competent people are better people. We can, and so, Stevens will racialize it and say, like, look, like white people are doing better, and so therefore they're clearly superior, right? And others, they're doing this like scientific racism thing at the time. And Coolidge wants to argue and say, no, like you don't have the idea that somebody is naturally better or they've earned more money and so they're morally superior or anything like that. But it's easier to sort of make those kinds of claims if you don't have a backstop of like, well, why are people equal? Like what makes them equal? And so, this is a debate in political theory, is to what extent, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had made the same argument in the Declaration and Sentiments, right? She says, humans are all creatures of God, right? And so it's arbitrary to then say that this one section is better. So that's a concern she has as well, right? So that I think is the place where Coolidge would be sort of most disconcerted, because he would fear whether you can in fact rigorously defend those things if you don't have the religious ideas behind it. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that he would say you have to have like Puritan Protestantism or something like that. But the basic idea that people are creatures of God and equal in that sense, I think he does think is essential to maintaining the logic of the Declaration. And so I think he would have concerns about, is that defensible, or is that in an era where there is, secularization overstates it though, because like the percentage of people who are actually like explicit atheists or something is not very high. But to the extent that there is sort of a movement away from some of these kinds of doctrines, I think that would concern him. I mean, that's definitely a theme that he comes back to a lot in that speech, is that he doesn't want to just think of everything as, I think he would call that a pagan materialism. If you're saying the value of people comes from sort of what they can do, how useful they are, how efficient they are, how productive they are. And, and this is one, again, where it cuts kind of across left and right in ways, because you have, versions of the business folks of his era that are saying like, we made all this money, we're superior. And he wants to resist a claim like that. Say, no, you're not superior. We're all basically equal and one step below God.
It's interesting because as you were talking, we've done episodes with Dr. Carice where he really digs into, the kind of religious aspect of the Declaration of Independence. But then Alexis de Tocqueville when he talks about religion and democracy. And we talked about that with Dr. Daniel Mahoney. So because I'm in this all the time, I'm starting to see, right, all of these threads kind of coming through. And is it right to say like Coolidge isn't pushing religion, and I'm thinking back, I think, to Alexis de Tocqueville, where it's like religion and morals are the basis of just like good government. And that, going back to Dr. Carice and talking about the Declaration, it is that a sense of equality that we're all created. And like you said, there are no levels of who gets more than others.
Yeah, well, also the who gets more, meaning in terms of like political dignity, right? Because again, Coolidge is not like like a proto-socialist or something like that. Yeah, I mean, and it's not, the Northwest Ordinance has the language saying that, religion and education are effectively indispensable. You see this. So that sentiment very much, and this is partly why, George Washington and John Marshall are against Jefferson's and Madison's efforts to disestablish the Virginia Church, the Anglican Church in the 1780s, because this is a very common sentiment that you need to have this sort of religious backing. Now, Tocqueville, as you know, makes the move to say, you need to have that religious backing, but religion does better if it doesn't have the government sort of pushing it. Because otherwise, he's looking at the example of France, where people, they don't view the church as serving God, they view the church as serving the king, and so therefore they don't trust the church, right? It's why Tocqueville actually argues that the best thing you can do for a church is actually separation of church and state. So to your question, is Coolidge pushing religion? Coolidge certainly is both making a political theory argument along the lines of what you said, but this is not unique to him. I mean, if you go back and look at presidential speeches, if you look at like FDR's speeches, if that speech were given today, people would howl it was theocratic, right? They are just much more comfortable. They're not like marching you into church at gunpoint, but they are sort of normatively comfortable invoking God in more than a sort of perfunctory, like God bless America at the end of the speech. So, I mean, Coolidge is not shy about his Christian faith in his speeches, but I mean, he's not a theocrat, like seeking to establish a national church or anything like that. But he doesn't think it's a problem to sort of normatively have the president endorse that position. Again, very few folks do until much later in American history. But he has made that, even separating that, his political theory, he says, is just like, it's an empirical. I mean, ironically, he would say, like, we can actually just see that these ideas gave rise to that, and that they're connected in a way. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the political theory connection, Tocqueville, Washington, Coolidge. You can read some of, Franklin Roosevelt's, I'm trying to remember which speech it is in World War II that I was rereading recently, that like is even more explicitly religious than like a sermon in a church would be. Like, it's quite striking. But the Coolidge speech really is one that, if you haven't read it, and it's not very long, it's worth rereading in full. It's a really, really sophisticated meditation on the Declaration. And without commenting particularly on what I think of the current president, I am very, 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 very confident that whatever speech is given on July 4th, 2026, will not be as impressive as Coolidge's 1926 speech, which, again, I think is one of the 3-5 best speeches in American history.
It is really interesting as I personally go through and learn about some of these people that we're talking about through primary sources. It gives us such a unique look into who they are, as opposed to, like you said, how people view them, how historians or political scientists or political theorists might view them. Being able to look at this, and teachers, if you're listening to this too, I was following along while Dr. Beienberg was talking about it, and the speech is very accessible, I think, to kids. It would be a really cool lesson to do, the Declaration of Independence, this one, perhaps then Gerald Ford's bicentennial speech, and just looking at that. So, Dr. Beienberg, thank you again for making me learn about a new person, and also kind of like him, I think. I don't know that I've ever disliked Calvin Coolidge. I think I was just non-interested in this person. So I will be very interested if you can continue this trend in our next episode. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.